Hi class, I hope that you're each doing well. In this module, we'll be exploring the development and expression of human sexuality. This module contains two videos, and in this first video, we'll be looking at sexual identity and the factors that influence it. Many people find it difficult to talk about sex. For some, it can be a sensitive and even an awkward topic that can lead to feelings of embarrassment or shame. In one study, researchers found that sex, death, and money are the three conversational topics that make people the most uncomfortable. For many, as we think about many of the negative messages about sex that a person might have been exposed to when they were young, these feelings shouldn't be surprising. Before we get started, let's see what your thoughts are. So what do you think? Hormones have a greater influence on sexual anatomy than sexual activity. Is this definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected mostly false, you're right. We're going to be taking a look at hormones and how they affect our sexual anatomy and the development of our anatomy. And we're also going to be looking at the role of hormones in affecting sexual activity. Let's look at another one. Teens who take abstinence pledges tend to be less sexually active than their non-pledging peers. Is this definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? The research suggests that this is mostly true. However, we're going to be looking at sex education and something called comprehensive sex education. And it's when people take abstinence pledges within a comprehensive sex education program that we see the greatest level of effectiveness. How about this one? Sexual orientation is best viewed as a continuum rather than distinct categories. Is this definitely true? Mostly true, mostly false, or definitely false? If you selected mostly true, you're right. We're going to be taking a look at a very well-known and interesting study that was done by a man named Alfred Kinsey. And we're going to take a look at what he found in terms of sexual orientation. Take a moment to reflect. Did you have a sex education program at school when you were maybe in junior high or middle school or high school? Do you think that the program was effective? Why or why not? We're going to be taking a look at comprehensive sex education programs in this particular module video. And I'd encourage you to think about your own experience and whether or not you think that the sex education program that you were exposed to when you were in school is lined up with what would be considered a comprehensive sex education program. So what will you be learning about in this module video? You're going to be learning about the key aspects of sexual identity. So we're not talking at this point about sexual orientation. We're talking about something distinctly different, sexual identity. We're also going to be looking at the influence of physiological factors on sexual differentiation and maturation. You're also going to be learning about the influence of psychosocial factors on aspects of sexuality like attitudes and behavior. And then we're going to be looking at gender differences in sexual socialization and how they affect each of us. Sexual identity is the complex of personal qualities, self-perceptions, attitudes, values, and preferences that guide one's sexual behavior. And there are several key aspects of sexual identity. One of these key aspects is sexual orientation. So we might think of, for example, heterosexuals, homosexuals, bisexuals, and other sexual orientations. So as you can see here, sexual orientation is just one piece of sexual identity. And sexual identity is something that is distinctly different from sexual orientation. So it's just a piece. Sexual orientation is simply a piece of that particular puzzle. Another key aspect of sexual identity is body image. And so body image involves how a person sees themselves physically, and it affects how one feels about themselves in the sexual domain. A third feature is one's sexual values and ethics. And as you know, sexual values and ethics are culturally imposed. And these are culturally imposed constraints on the expectations that one has regarding sexual behavior. And these vary due to many different factors that can include things like gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Some examples include absolutism, where there's the belief that sexual activity outside of marriage isn't acceptable. Another is relativism, and this is where one believes that the relationship determines whether sexual activity is appropriate. And then there's hedonism. This is another example, where one believes that anything goes. A fourth key feature is erotic preferences. And these are the individual differences in what people find enjoyable. There are many different influences on sexual behavior and sexual attitudes. And it's important for us to consider each of these. So let's start with the physiological influences on sexual behavior and attitudes. As we think about this, it's important for us to first consider how hormones affect sexual development. When you were developing in the womb, there were some very important biological developments that were taking place that affected your sex. Sexual differentiation is a complex process, and it results in a newborn baby who is typically described as either male or female. But sometimes this isn't what happens. In other words, we may not see typical sexual differentiation. In these instances, individuals may develop both male and female characteristics, and this is referred to as intersexuality. It's estimated that about 1 in 1,000 children are born intersexed, and if we include additional sexual differentiation issues like Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome that some of you may have learned about in other classes like lifespan psychology, then the rate of this is much higher. So hormones play a key role in sexual differentiation. During prenatal development, when you were developing in your mother's womb, at about the 3rd month, the gonads, which are the sex glands, they produce androgens. And when we think of androgens, we can think of, for example, the male hormone testosterone. This then causes masculinization of the genitals in the male fetus. In females, the ovaries produce estrogens, and this is the principal class of female sex hormones. So both estrogens and androgens are present, as many of you know, in both sexes, but in different amounts. It's the amount of testosterone produced that affects the development of the genitals, and it's typically high in males and low in females. So problems in the formation of chromosomes, in gonads, or external genitalia can lead to a range of intersex conditions. And some examples of these include congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Another is related to testosterone biosynthetic issues. And this is where individuals don't have the properly functioning enzymes that are needed to convert cholesterol into testosterone. And when these enzymes aren't capable of creating testosterone, then the genitals appear female. And when the enzymes function at a low level, then ambiguous genitals form. Another example is androgen insensitivity syndrome. So this is where an individual who is XY, so they are genetically male, is unable to react to androgens. So there are some additional examples of sexual differentiation issues that aren't often thought of as being in the same category as the ones I just mentioned. And those are those like Klinefelter syndrome or Turner syndrome. And I'd encourage you to learn more about these. And if you take lifespan psychology, you'll learn about them. But just to give you a glimpse into this, Klinefelter syndrome is due to genetics. And instead of a person having a standard XX or XY chromosomal makeup, they have an XXY, and they typically live as men. They end up having smaller than what is typical genitals and low androgen secretion. I think it's important overall to pause for a moment and to think about, first of all, the frequency of intersex happening for someone to be born intersex. That's 1 in approximately 1,000, so the rate is pretty high. So if you are going into a helping profession, chances are you're going to be working with someone, at least one person, probably more, who have this experience. I think it's important for us to also think about the importance of that individual being aware of what's happening in their bodies. So children who are born with deviations from typical development of the sex organs, they can expect to grow up to be very successful and to lead very enriched lives. But it's so important for them to be aware of any physical issues that they might experience, and also just to be aware and informed of any differences that they may be more likely to experience than, say, someone who is not intersexed. So, for example, as we think about the potential reasons for any issues related to atypical sex differentiation, we want to think about the specific causes. And the reason for this is because there are different treatments. And I'm not suggesting that there are treatments that are there necessarily to make that individual more typical. That's up to the individual to decide. And we as a society we should not be imposing our own values on them. But what I am saying, though, is when we think about treatment, we want to think about any health issues that might be associated with any issues that are related to atypical sex differentiation. And some of these intersex examples that I provide can have some additional health-related issues. It's also important for parents to be aware of whatever it is that the child is experiencing. It's so important for them to have a good understanding of both the condition of sex differentiation that affects their child and the possible ways for helping their child, so that when they do have this information, the child is better able to lead a fulfilled life and to look forward to a life that is full of enriched experiences that are not negatively affected by any feelings that they may have that they're not as valued or that there is something wrong with what they're experiencing. Because again, individuals who are intersex can lead very enriching and fulfilled lives, and they can look forward to having a great education, career, marriage, and often parenthood. Hormones play a key role in sexual behavior throughout adolescence and into adulthood. And androgens affect sexual motivation. So, for example, testosterone, which is a type of androgen, is linked to higher rates of sexual activity. As men get older, they will typically have some decline in testosterone. I think it's unfortunate, though, the way that sometimes decreasing levels of testosterone is portrayed. And I say this because more recently I've seen some advertisements that are directed towards men who may have declining levels of testosterone. So I know I've seen one advertisement on TV where the person who is narrating the commercial is saying something like, "Do you have low T?" As though saying low testosterone is not a good thing. I know I've also seen a facility here in our Tri-Cities area that's called the Low T Center. And it's great that there are centers who are there to help men as they experience changing levels of hormones. But by calling something the low T center, I wonder what effect this may have on men as they think about their lowered levels of testosterone. Do men feel more comfortable going somewhere that's called the low T center than the low testosterone center? Or might we use a more scientific name or a name that is more related to the natural changes that people experience throughout their lives? So something for us to think about. I think the language we use is very important. The language that we see in advertisements, of course, on television, and even just our everyday language, which sometimes can show up in what businesses are called. So, what else influences sexual behavior and activity? Well, psychosocial influences also play an important role. And one type of psychosocial influence is one's family. Now, parents are central to adolescents' lives, and an extensive amount of research actually shows that parents can influence adolescents and young adults' sexual decision making in very positive ways. So we could say that direct communication among parents and children about issues related to sex is important. I wonder how many of you had parents who talked with you about sex. I have a very vivid yet perhaps strange memory as a child. I remember one of my mom's friends had taken me to the library, and I would guess I was probably 11 or 12 years of age. And I remember when she was checking out books at the library, she was checking out this really old book about how to talk to children about sex. Now, I guess I thought about this because I knew who her three sons were, and it was just weird for me as a kid to see that. But more importantly, I think what I do remember, and it was a good thing that she was doing this, but what I do remember thinking was that's a really old book. And so I think it's important for us to remember that when parents do provide information, they may be correct, of course, but it may also be incorrect, or it may be outdated or incomplete. So parents need to be up to date on their knowledge and information that they share with their kids. In addition to parental influences, peers are also an important influence. And we know that peer pressure is not uncommon. And actually, research suggests that adolescents may not be so much looking at whether or not they're ready to have sex, but they're more concerned or affected by the illusion that everyone else is having sex. Also, friends provide a lot of information regarding sex, and sometimes this information is not very accurate. But it's also important to note that a positive peer influence is associated with less risky behavior. But again, peers can be a source of highly misleading information. I remember in one class that I was teaching that one of the students said that their friend had told them that the best way to avoid getting pregnant was to stand on one's head after having sex. Now, this is definitely not a great approach to avoiding pregnancy. If anything, it's probably or potentially going to increase the likelihood of one getting pregnant. So I thought this was a great example. I'm sure some of you can come up with some in your own mind of some examples of misinformation that you've heard from your friends. Another potential source of influence on sexual attitudes and behavior is schools. So the vast majority of parents and other adults support sex education programs in schools. Even though we see a lot of attention in the media at times, depending upon what's going on in the media, but it seems like when there's a lull in the media, that there's some attention given to things like this, potential attention given to protests of where people may be against sex education. But actually, research suggests that abstinence-only programs don't deter adolescents from engaging in sex. And instead, comprehensive programs are associated with an increase in the use of contraception. They're also associated with reduced pregnancies, reduced high-risk sexual behavior, and there's a potential to decrease early sex and the number of partners. So what exactly is a comprehensive sex education program? Well, it is a curriculum-based process of teaching and learning, and the focus is on the various aspects of sexuality, including the cognitive, emotional, physical, and social aspects of sexuality. And it aims to equip adolescents and young people with knowledge and with skills and with attitudes and values that will empower them to realize their health, their well-being, and their dignity. This type of program also aims to develop respectful social and sexual relationships and to help young people to consider how their choices affect their own well-being and how their choices affect other people, and to help them to understand and to ensure that they're protected, that their rights are protected throughout their lives. So overall, what can we say about the research related to sex education that's comprehensive? Well, we know that it does not increase sexual activity, and it does not increase sexual risk-taking behavior, and it does not increase the incidence of sexually transmitted diseases or HIV infection rates. What the research also suggests, as I mentioned again, is that programs that promote abstinence only have been found to be ineffective in delaying sexual initiation. Now, incorporating abstinence as part of a comprehensive program can be an effective approach, but an abstinence-only program has not been found to be very effective in delaying the initiation of sex or in reducing the frequency of sex or reducing the number of sex partners. What the research also suggests is that sex education that's comprehensive has the most impact when school-based programs are complemented with the involvement of parents and teachers. Religion also plays an important role in attitudes related to sex and in behaviors as well. And so this varies, though, from religion to religion, and it also varies depending upon the individual and their own experiences and upbringings and the role that they feel or want religion to play in their life. The media is clearly another source of potential influence on sexual behavior. So think about this. Viewing violent media seems to be associated with violent behavior, whereas viewing pro-social media, like viewing people doing things that are good, helping others, for example, or doing other good deeds, that is associated with positive behavior. So is it plausible then that this relationship could be true for sexual content too? What do you think? Well, there was an interesting study that was done called Growing Up with the Media. And this study involved 14 to 21-year-old participants. And researchers first wanted to know about the level of exposure the participants had to sexual behavior in the media. And so what they found was that 47% of their participants reported being exposed to a lot of sexual content. And they said that many, if not almost all, or at least one type of media they consumed depicted sexual situations that ranged from people kissing to people having sex. Now, conversely, very few of the participants, only 8%, reported low exposure to sexual content. So researchers found that for those who reported that their media consumption had almost no sexual content, they found that only 2% of those individuals had ever had sex. In contrast, among youth who stated that most or almost all of the media they consumed contained sexual content, 60% of them reported sexual activity. Now, interestingly, the average age of these two groups did not differ. So in other words, the reason that they were seeing what they were seeing wasn't because older youth were both more likely to consume sexual media and also more likely to be sexually active. What's also interesting is that sexually active youth who consumed the most sexual media were also less likely to regularly use condoms compared to those who consumed the least amount of sexual content in media. Now, for some of you, as you're hearing this, you may be thinking about the difference between correlational and experimental research. Remember, correlation does not mean causation. We couldn't test something like this experimentally, at least ethically. But we can see some relationships through correlational research, and this is where correlational research can be useful. So here, it's not clear from this study if we're seeing these trends because youth who have more sex are also more likely to seek out sexual material, or if it's because sexualized media is causing youth to become more sexually active. But there definitely appears to be a relationship between the two. There's also some additional points and related points related to the role of the media in sexual socialization. So first, we know that overall Americans in general see thousands of sexual encounters a year on various forms of media. And of course, these range from the fairly benign to actual sexual activity. And for adolescents, research does suggest that viewing sexual content on TV is increased or linked to an increase in sexual activity. It's also linked to an increase in intentions to engage in sexual behavior, not just based on this study, but on other studies as well. And as we think about other sources of media, we can also think about music lyrics and music videos that are also potential vehicles for sexual socialization. And then we can think about video games that can also contain sexually explicit content, where women are often depicted in very sexualized ways. And then two, we can think about the internet, as the internet provides both sexually explicit material, but it also can provide useful information about a variety of sexual topics. So the media provides a variety of sources of information and sources of potential influence on sexual behavior and attitudes. In the diagram here, you'll see sexual content in television programs by genre. So researchers examined over 100 hours of TV per week for the years of 2001 to 2002. Now, this was 20 years ago. I tried to find a comparable diagram for today, and I wasn't able to find one. But I wanted to share this with you because I think it's a nice point of comparison. I wonder what you think. Do you think that we see about the same amount of sexual content, or do you think it's increased? So what's meant by sexual content? Well, the researchers measured things like sexual talk, meaning conversations about sex or comments about sexual actions. And they also measured sexual behavior, which would include intimate touching and implied sex. And as you can see here, sexual content was common in a variety of television genres. So again, I wonder, what do you think this would compare to, or how do you think this would compare to today? If any of you come across a comparable diagram, please feel free to send it to me. I'd love to be able to share that with the class. Take a moment now to reflect. Your textbook suggests that sexual socialization takes different forms in males and females. Why do you think our societal norms encourage females to feel guilty about engaging in sexual activity, as your textbook suggests? Do you think that the double standard for males and females regarding sexual activity is still in force today? What does the research suggest about any gender differences in sexual socialization? Well, researchers have uncovered some small differences. Men are slightly more likely to engage in casual sex, and men are more likely to use pornography. Men also have sex somewhat more frequently and have more sexual partners. And men tend to be more permissive in their attitudes towards sex in general. Men are also less likely to feel negative emotions in response to sex than women are. As you think about some of these differences between males and females and their sexual socialization, what do you think may explain some of these differences? Well, it's thought that some of these differences may be explained by a sexual double standard. What do you think about that? It's also suggested that there may be a conquest orientation in males, and that there's an importance of physical attractiveness and catching a mate in females. And in females, there's also some feelings of sexual guilt. With these differing views of sexuality and relationships, males and females can be out of sync with one another. And some researchers suggest that because members of a homosexual couple have been socialized similarly, they're less likely than straight couples to have problems with incompatible expectations. Let's now take a few moments for you to test yourself. Which of the following was not identified as an aspect of sexual identity? Is it sexual orientation, erotic preferences, gender expression, or body image? If you selected gender expression, you're right. If you didn't remember what these are, you can look in your textbook and you can also rewind the video to the beginning. Here's another one. Produced by the ovaries are blank, the principal class of female sex hormones. Produced by the testes are blank, the principal class of male sex hormones. So which of these is the correct answer? Is it estrogens and masculins, estrogens and androgens, hormogens and testosterones, or is it menarches and supermenarches? If you selected estrogens and androgens, you're right. So estrogens are produced by the ovaries, and they're the principal class of female sex hormones. And androgens are produced by the testes, and they're the principal class of male sex hormones. Let's try this one. Different messages about sexuality are conveyed to young adolescent boys and girls in America. One message girls typically receive, according to what you've learned, is to initiate sex acts devoid of any emotional attachment, be mastery-oriented throughout their sexual initiation and development, view sex as part of a loving monogamous relationship, or use sex as a tool to acquire their needs. So what is the most typical message based on what the research suggests? While each of you may have your own individual perspectives and your own individual experiences, what the research suggests is that a message that girls typically receive is that sex is viewed as part of a loving monogamous relationship. Let's take a moment to think about sex education programs in schools. So, which of the following statements about sex education programs in schools is most accurate? Abstinence-only programs significantly reduce the number of sexual partners. Abstinence-only programs increase reliable and effective barrier contraceptive usage. Comprehensive programs reduce high-risk sexual behavior, or comprehensive programs promote having early sex. If you selected comprehensive programs reduce high-risk sexual behavior, you're right. We know that abstinence-only programs aren't that effective. And we also know that comprehensive programs don't promote having early sex. Take a moment to reflect back on what a comprehensive sex education program is. Remember, a comprehensive sex education program is curriculum-based, and it's a process of teaching and learning about the cognitive, emotional, physical, and social aspects of sexuality. And as you'll remember, it aims to equip young people with the knowledge and the skills, attitudes, and values that will empower them to realize their health and their well-being and their dignity. It also helps to empower young people to develop respectful social and sexual relationships. It also encourages young people to consider how their choices affect their own well-being and the well-being of others, and to understand and ensure the protection of their rights throughout their lives. So a comprehensive sex education program is more than just teaching someone about physical anatomy or about what sex is or about contraception. It involves a lot more than that. It encompasses, again, those cognitive, emotional, physical, and social aspects of sexuality. What have you learned? Well, you've learned about the key aspects of sexual identity, and you've learned about the influence of physiological factors like hormones on sexual differentiation and maturation. You learned about the effects of hormones prenatally and during adolescence. You also learned about the influence of psychosocial factors on aspects of sexuality like attitudes and behavior. And you learned about gender differences in sexual socialization and how they can affect individuals. So what will you be learning about next? In our second video of 2 videos, you'll be learning about Kinsey's research on sexual behavior. You'll also be learning about the research findings on sexual orientation and what the research says about some of the contemporary attitudes on homosexuality. And then you'll learn about the process of disclosing one's sexual orientation and the adjustment that's experienced. As always, if you have any questions after watching this video or after reading your textbook, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I look forward to seeing each of you online.